Oh my God, you are so clumsy. This is exactly why people like you don't belong here. The words cut through the air like shards of glass, spat from the mouth of a proud, middle-aged woman with icy blue eyes and pearls dangling from her neck. She shouted at the black woman before her, a striking figure in an emerald green gown, her posture unshaken, even under the weight of humiliation. Her name was Danielle Carter. Gasps flickered around the marble foyer of the grand hotel ballroom. Then came the laughter, sharp, cruel, poisonous. Dozens of wealthy guests in custom-tailored tuxedos and shimmering dresses lifted their phones to record what they assumed would be the scandal of the night. The woman with platinum blonde hair, perfectly coiffed into an elegant wave, stepped closer, her heels clicking against marble. "You're nothing, you hear me? Nothing. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as decent people in this room. Security, get this disaster out of here before she ruins something valuable. People like her, always trouble." Her shrill voice echoed until suddenly, thud. Danielle was shoved hard to the floor, red wine spilling across her dress in a violent splash. For a moment, it looked like the night had swallowed her whole. But then, slowly, she pushed herself up. Her hands trembled not from weakness, but from fire burning within her. Wine dripped down her gown in steady beats, striking the marble like the ticking of a clock. In her hand, her phone. In her eyes, something terrifying, an unflinching resolve. The room hushed, unease curling at the edges. The platinum-haired woman wasn't finished. She leaned down, close enough that her perfume cut through the scent of wine. Her voice fell to a hiss, but somehow every guest could hear it. "You're wretched, worthless, and you will never be more than what you are right now. Nothing." The cruelty was complete. Or so she thought. Danielle rose, tall and steady, straightening the stained silk of her dress, as though nothing, neither the fall nor the insult, could break her dignity. Around her, eyes darted. Some were gleeful, some wide with disbelief, and many glowing from the cameras in their hands. Every single one of them assumed they had just witnessed the destruction of a woman who did not matter. But they were wrong, dead wrong, because Danielle Carter was about to show them who she really was. The air thickened, as if the universe itself had paused, bracing for what would come. She lifted her phone. Her gaze swept the crowd, and with every second that passed, the arrogance of the room began to feel fragile. Because whatever Danielle Carter was about to do, it would not only shatter the moment, it would shatter them. Now, let's pause. If you believe in treating every person with respect, no matter their color, their background, or their story, say it. Type respect in the comments, because what Danielle Carter was about to unleash would leave this so-called high society family in ruins. You see, this wasn't the first time the Carson family had used cruelty to protect their crumbling empire, but it would be the last time they underestimated a woman like Danielle. Danielle Carter was no ordinary guest at this gala. At 47 years old, she was one of the most powerful CEOs in the United States, with a personal net worth north of $61 billion. She had carved her empire, Carter International Holdings, from nothing over 2 relentless decades. From real estate to aerospace to consumer tech, her companies shaped the skylines, economies, and workforces of nations. She employed over 120,000 people worldwide, but she had never forgotten where she came from. Raised by a single grandmother in a small Ohio town, Danielle had grown up watching that woman work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. She carried that legacy with her every day, a promise etched in her bones, to never let anyone make her, or people like her, feel small again. And tonight, she was about to keep that promise. Now, let's talk about the Carsons. On the surface, they looked like the glittering picture of old money America. But peel back the polished layers, and the rot was everywhere. Edward Carson, 65, the patriarch, had inherited a vast real estate empire decades ago. For years, he tried desperately to live up to the Carson name, but bad deals, reckless speculation, and market shifts had gutted the business. Behind closed doors, Carson Industries was collapsing. Secret loans, hidden debts, and financial sleight of hand kept the truth buried. For now, Patricia Carson, 60, his wife, was Manhattan social royalty, or so she liked to believe. She lived for the spotlight of galas and charity luncheons, not out of kindness, but for control. For Patricia, exclusion was power, and she reveled in it. The thought of losing her standing among the city's elite terrified her more than the ruin of her family's finances. Their son, Michael, 30, was a spoiled wreck in designer sneakers. He had coasted through life with no purpose, every business venture handed to him collapsing under his incompetence. He spent nights in penthouses, days nursing hangovers, and never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Their daughter, Lily, 27, was dangerous in a different way. Stunning, calculating, and merciless, she had inherited her mother's sharp tongue and wielded it like a dagger. Lily thrived on humiliating those beneath her. For her, cruelty wasn't just an act, it was an art form. But here's the kicker. None of them knew just how close they were to losing everything. That night's gala was supposed to be their salvation. The charity event doubled as a celebration, a stage for Edward Carson's grand announcement, the biggest deal of his career, a $1.3 billion merger between Carson Industries and Carter International Holdings. The deal was his lifeline, his company's last chance at survival. If it went through, the Carsons would not only crawl out of bankruptcy, they would rise richer than ever. But now, standing wine-stained and unbroken in the center of that marble foyer, Danielle Carter knew the truth. The Carsons had just humiliated the very woman whose signature could determine their future. And in that moment, Danielle understood her power. With one word, one choice, she could end them. And trust me, she would. The night air along Fifth Avenue carried the crisp bite of October in Manhattan, cool enough to make the breath visible, but not so cold as to keep the city from shining in its usual brilliance. The avenue itself glowed like a river of light, headlights reflecting off polished black cars lined up outside the grand glass entrance of one of New York's most prestigious buildings. Valets in tailored uniforms moved with precision, opening doors, whisking away coats, and ushering in guests whose laughter floated up toward the gilded facade of the Carson family's penthouse. To any passerby, it looked like an evening of triumph, a gala to celebrate wealth, success, and charity. But beneath the shimmering surface, the truth was far less stable. For the Carson family, this night was more than an evening of society gossip. It was a lifeline, a last-ditch effort to secure their empire with a $1.3 billion merger that would save them from financial ruin. What none of their guests could imagine was that the key to their survival was already standing on the curb outside, stepping out of a sleek black Maybach with quiet confidence and deliberate grace. Her name was Danielle Carter. At 47 years old, Danielle was one of the most powerful women in corporate America. With a net worth over $61 billion, she had built her fortune not from inheritance or luck, but from grit, vision, and relentless determination. Born in a working-class Ohio neighborhood, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away too young, Danielle had climbed through obstacles most people would never survive. She knew poverty, she knew dismissal, she knew the sting of being underestimated, and she had turned all of it into power. Now, stepping onto the marble sidewalk in her emerald green gown, she looked every inch the mogul she was. The gown, a custom piece from an American designer whose waiting list stretched 2 years, hugged her figure with understated elegance. Her jewelry, diamonds and platinum, was simple but unmistakably expensive, the kind that never shouted but whispered wealth in a language only the truly powerful understood. Her hair, styled into soft waves, shimmered under the Manhattan lights. To anyone with sense, she was not just another guest. She was the guest. And yet, the cruel irony was this. Danielle Carter owned the very building in which this gala was being held. Purchased through one of her real estate companies, the penthouse where the Carsons entertained tonight technically belonged to her. But she never flaunted such details. Her power was quieter, more lethal. She believed in letting actions speak louder than ownership. Still, as she looked up at the glowing windows above, Danielle couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was supposed to be her night. For months, lawyers and intermediaries had hammered out the details of a partnership between Carter International Holdings and Carson Industries. Tonight was the evening the deal would be finalized, contracts signed, and champagne poured in celebration. Danielle had looked forward to this moment, not only because of the financial implications, but because she genuinely believed in second chances. She had seen the numbers, knew the Carsons were in trouble, and chose to extend a lifeline. She imagined shaking Edward Carson's hand, meeting Patricia with cordiality, even congratulating their children on being part of a legacy that would survive because of this deal. It had been a long time since Danielle had allowed herself to feel this kind of hope, a hope rooted not in survival, but in generosity. Her chauffeur opened the car door, and Danielle stepped out with the poise of a queen descending from her carriage. Conversations on the sidewalk paused for a moment. A few heads turned. People who noticed her arrival sensed something extraordinary, but couldn't quite place it. She exuded an aura that was hard to define, but impossible to ignore. Inside her evening clutch was a platinum pen, specially chosen for signing the contracts later that night. She had smiled when her assistant suggested it. Was it too theatrical? Too obvious? Danielle didn't think so. Symbolism mattered. Tonight wasn't just business, it was history. As she approached the main entrance, her heels clicking softly against marble, she rehearsed the evening in her mind. She pictured Edward Carson standing at the center of the room, surrounded by investors and socialites. She imagined his relief when he realized his empire would live another day. She imagined Patricia's forced but polite gratitude. She imagined the applause as the merger was announced and the Carters' guests toasted their future. But more than that, Danielle imagined her grandmother. She imagined the woman who had once scrubbed floors in hospitals and stitched clothes late into the night just to keep a roof over their heads. She imagined her voice, steady and strong, telling her, "Baby, you belong anywhere your feet take you." For Danielle, this gala was not just a contract signing, it was proof of that truth. Yet, life has a way of turning pride into prelude. The instant she reached the valet station, the first crack in the evening appeared. A young man in a fitted jacket and polished shoes barely glanced at her before pointing toward the back alley. "Service entrance is around the corner, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped, perfunctory, and dismissive. Danielle froze for a heartbeat. It wasn't the first time someone had mistaken her for staff, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. Still, she smiled politely. "I'm here for the gala," she said. The valet hesitated, eyes narrowing in confusion. It was as though his brain could not compute the sight of a black woman in a gown that cost more than his annual salary arriving as a guest. He muttered something under his breath, then gestured reluctantly toward the front doors. Danielle's smile faded slightly, though her posture never faltered. She walked past him with grace, but inside she felt the faintest tug of unease. She told herself it was nothing, a misunderstanding. Tonight was too important for her to let irritation cloud her mood. The main entrance loomed before her. Tall glass doors framed in gold, guarded by a man in a pressed uniform, standing behind a podium. His name tag read, Jake. Danielle watched him for a few minutes as she waited in line, observing the flow of guests. It was a simple process. One after another, wealthy New Yorkers, white men and women in gowns and tuxedos, handed Jake their invitations. He barely glanced at them before waving each one inside with a warm smile. "Good evening. Enjoy the party," he repeated like a well-rehearsed script. A woman in a mink coat approached with her invitation half hidden in her purse. Jake nodded, smiled, and ushered her in without even touching the envelope. A man in a tuxedo, still chatting loudly on his phone, flashed something vaguely resembling an invitation and was practically escorted through the door by Jake himself. Danielle's turn came. She handed over her embossed invitation, the same kind that had granted dozens of others entry without delay. But the moment Jake saw her name, Carter, his demeanor changed. The smile disappeared. His brows furrowed. He studied the card as though it might be counterfeit. He checked the guest list, running his finger down the paper not once, not twice, but 3 times. "I don't see any Carter on here," he said loudly enough for others in line to hear. Danielle's chest tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "Please check again. I'm expected." Jake sighed, flipping the pages of his list with exaggerated effort. "No Carter. Now, anyone can fake these nowadays. They print them at Kinko's, make them look official." He glanced at her again, suspicion etched across his face. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Danielle handed him her New York State driver's license. It was legitimate, updated only months earlier. Still, Jake examined it with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. He held it up to the light, rubbed his thumb across the surface, even pulled out a small flashlight to inspect its holograms. "This doesn't look real to me," he announced loudly, making sure other guests heard. "The picture doesn't even look like you. The picture looked exactly like her." Danielle's calm began to crack. Around her, people whispered, their curiosity piqued. Behind her, a couple arrived with their invitation. Jake barely glanced at it before ushering them inside, all while Danielle remained standing outside in the October chill. What she didn't know then was that this humiliating delay was only the beginning. The night that was supposed to be hers, the night meant to celebrate her generosity and power, was about to turn into a battlefield. And as the city glittered around her, Danielle Carter felt, for the first time in years, that she might be walking straight into the storm. The moment Danielle Carter reached the main doors of the Carson penthouse, the subtle unease she had felt outside sharpened into something undeniable. The glow of chandeliers reflected against the tall glass panels, illuminating the broad marble entrance, where guests streamed through as if carried by an invisible tide of privilege. The man at the podium, Jake, was the sort of figure who looked like he had been born for this job. Tall, square-shouldered, with the permanent squint of someone used to suspicion. His uniform fit tightly across his chest, his tie straight, shoes polished. To the guests passing by, he was nothing more than part of the scenery, a gatekeeper meant to keep out chaos and maintain order. But for Danielle, he became the first wall in what would turn into a fortress of prejudice. She had been watching for several minutes, carefully observing how he treated others. The pattern was obvious, as steady and predictable as a metronome. Each guest, white, wealthy, cloaked in fur, silk, and satin, approached the podium with little more than a nod. Invitations flashed briefly, waved away with a smile. "Good evening, enjoy the party," Jake would say, like a well-trained chorus, repeating the same line again and again. A woman in a fur stole pulled a crumpled invitation from her purse, barely unfolding it before Jake allowed her inside. A young man, his tuxedo wrinkled and tie crooked, talked loudly on his cell phone as he breezed past. He raised something that might have been an invitation, though no one could say for sure. Jake smiled, nodded, even held the door for him. It was smooth, effortless, automatic. Then came Danielle's turn. She stepped forward with quiet dignity, offering the embossed invitation she had carried in her clutch since leaving her Maybach. It was printed on the same heavy stock as every other guest's, engraved with the Carson crest and gold lettering. There was no mistaking it for anything but authentic. But the moment Jake's eyes landed on her name, everything shifted. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a hardness that bordered on contempt. He didn't glance at her invitation and wave her through like the others. Instead, he picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and studied it as if it were a forged document. "What's the name?" he asked, his tone flat but loud enough for people behind Danielle to hear. "Carter, Danielle Carter," she answered evenly. Jake frowned, running his finger down the guest list before him. "Carter, Carter. I don't see any Carter on here." Danielle kept her composure. "Would you mind checking again?" she asked politely. "I'm expected." The man sighed with exaggerated effort, flipped back to the first page, and started again. "No Carter, not on the list." Behind her, a couple approached. Another fur coat, another tuxedo. Jake looked up, smiled broadly, and waved them in, without even touching their invitation. Then he looked back at Danielle, his expression cool, suspicious. "Ma'am, anybody can print one of these at Kinko's these days. They make them look all official." "You'd be surprised," he said, shaking her invitation as if it were a fake $20 bill. Danielle's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I can assure you, this invitation is legitimate. I was personally invited." Jake crossed his arms. "Then I'm going to need to see some identification." From her clutch, Danielle pulled out her driver's license, issued just months earlier. She handed it to him, without hesitation, her fingers steady. It was official, state-issued, perfectly valid. But Jake didn't glance at it and hand it back. He examined it with the zeal of a detective searching for flaws. He tilted it toward the overhead light, ran his thumb across the surface as though he could feel deception through touch, and even produced a small flashlight from his pocket. "This doesn't look real to me," he announced loudly, once again ensuring that others heard. "The picture doesn't even look like you." The picture looked exactly like her. A few guests waiting nearby glanced at her, then at each other, their whispers rising like smoke. Danielle heard fragments. "Doesn't look like she belongs. Oh, probably trying to sneak in." "You know how these things go." Danielle inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had been through worse in her lifetime. Worse than this man, worse than whispers, worse than suspicion dressed up as procedure. Still, the sting was real. "I can promise you, this is authentic," she said, her voice steady. Jake shook his head. "We'll have to verify this with management. You'll need to wait out here while we check." And with that, he walked off, with both her license and her invitation. Danielle stood outside as the October wind nipped at her shoulders, her gown no match for the chill. She wrapped her arms lightly across her torso, careful not to wrinkle the fabric. 1 minute passed, then 5, then 20. Each time Jake returned, his words were the same. "Still checking with management. Won't be much longer." But Danielle could see him through the glass doors. He wasn't calling anyone. He wasn't speaking to managers. He was leaning against the podium, laughing with another guard, sipping coffee. She knew then what she had suspected from the start. He wasn't verifying anything. He was waiting her out, hoping she would grow frustrated and leave. The humiliation deepened with every passing moment. Guests who arrived late were admitted instantly, some with barely visible invitations. A group of young socialites stumbled toward the entrance, giggling, obviously drunk. Jake grinned, waved them in, and wished them a wonderful evening. One woman, draped in mink, actually shifted away from Danielle on the sidewalk, as though proximity alone might contaminate her gown. Another man muttered to his companion, "Some people just don't know their place." Danielle stood her ground. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Nearly 2 hours passed. By then, she had missed the cocktail hour, the networking, the dinner service, even the orchestra's opening set. Her feet ached from standing in heels against the cold pavement. Her hair, once styled to perfection, had begun to frizz in the damp night air. The excitement she had carried with her earlier had dissolved into something darker, a growing dread that the hostility she had experienced at the door was only a foreshadowing of what awaited her inside. Finally, Jake reappeared, his tone grudging. "All right, you're cleared. You can go in now." He handed back her license and invitation, though his eyes still carried suspicion. Danielle accepted them with dignity, though the ache in her chest burned hotter than the October wind. She had been delayed, dismissed, and demeaned at the door of a building she owned, a gala meant to celebrate her generosity. As she stepped through the glass doors into the marble foyer, the warm air washed over her. Conversations floated, laughter rang, champagne glasses clinked. The party was in full swing. And yet, Danielle Carter felt no relief. The door had opened, but she had already seen the truth. Prejudice was not an accident here. It was a ritual. And something told her the night's worst humiliation had only just begun. The doors to the penthouse swung open with the kind of grandeur only New York's elite could afford. A flood of warm, golden light spilled from the marble-floored entrance as guests entered, their laughter mingling with the faint sound of a string quartet playing in the background. The rich, velvety scent of expensive perfumes and wine wafted through the air, mixing with the delicate scent of roses from the grand arrangements decorating every corner. To anyone watching, it was the epitome of wealth, elegance, and sophistication. A gathering of the city's finest. The sort of event where business deals were struck behind the clink of glasses, where names were dropped and whispered into the ears of potential partners, where reputations were solidified for another year of unchallenged dominance. For most of the people inside, it was a night of celebration, a night that had been carefully designed to mark the salvation of the Carson family's empire. But for Danielle Carter, it was an entry into a house of mirrors, one where the reflection of her own worth would soon be warped, distorted, and shattered. As Danielle stepped through the doorway, The full weight of what she was about to face settled over her. She paused just inside, gathering her composure, every muscle in her body holding tight against the turbulence she could feel in the air. This wasn't going to be a warm welcome. It had never been about the deal. It had always been about the control they thought they held over her. She was nothing more than a pawn in their game, an investment to be used or discarded as they saw fit. The first face to spot her was Patricia Carson, the matriarch of the family, who stood near the center of the room, her posture regal, her eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk on the hunt. The moment Patricia saw Danielle's face, her smile faltered. Danielle had not expected the warmth she had imagined, nor the gracious handshakes she had so carefully planned in her mind. Instead, Patricia's gaze flickered with suspicion, then turned to something colder. Disdain, perhaps. The words escaped Patricia's lips without hesitation, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Oh my God, how did the cleaning lady get past security?" The room froze for a moment, as though the air had thickened. The laughter from the crowd turned into an uncomfortable murmur. People paused mid-conversation, eyes darting toward the woman who had been invited to save their empire, now standing in the doorway, her gown shimmering in the golden light. Danielle stood still, her face expressionless, as she processed the verbal assault. There was no fight in her eyes, not yet. No anger, no outrage, just a calm, almost icy stillness that told the room she had already seen this kind of prejudice far too many times in her life to be thrown off by it now. Behind Patricia, Edward Carson, 65, the family patriarch, had been in the midst of telling a story to a small group of investors. When he heard his wife's sharp words, he stopped mid-sentence, his voice trailing off as his eyes fell on Danielle. "This is a private event, not a job fair," he bellowed across the room, his voice carrying with the authority of a man who thought himself untouchable. The words were harsh, cold, and cutting. The room fell silent again, though the guests were unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or look away. Some, those who had been raised in circles of old money, nodded slightly, as though in approval. Others stood frozen, uncertain how to react to the sharpness of Edward's rebuke. Danielle's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm. This was not the first time she had been called out in a public setting, nor would it be the last. "Security," Edward called out once more, his tone tinged with the kind of irritation one might direct toward a stubborn pest. "Remove this disaster before she ruins anything else." And then, like some twisted comedy show, the spectacle began. Brandon Carson, the 30-year-old son, stumbled toward Danielle, clearly 3 drinks past tipsy. His polished black tuxedo and crisp white shirt contrasted sharply with the sloppy grin spreading across his face. He raised his glass of champagne, as though preparing to deliver a speech. Only the words that came out were neither clever nor sophisticated. "Did someone order maid service? Because I think our bathrooms could use some attention," Brandon said loudly, slurring the last word with a smirk that spread across his face like a taunt. His friends, equally drunk, burst into laughter, clinking their glasses together, as if he had delivered some sort of masterstroke of comedy. Danielle's gaze met his, her expression unmoving. It was as if she were watching a child throw a tantrum, a childish spectacle with no real power behind it. But the audience wasn't so discerning. The laughter grew louder, as if they were witnessing something brilliant instead of petty and cruel. Nearby, Sophia Carson, the 27-year-old daughter, stood with her arms around a couple of other socialites, posing for photos, with that false charm, so common among the privileged. Her laughter was high-pitched, almost musical, as she observed the scene. "She's probably looking for the broom closet," Sophia quipped, her words laced with cruelty. "Someone should point her in the right direction." More laughter followed, crueler now, louder. Phones began to flicker to life, recording what they presumed would be a moment of entertainment for the night. The rich, spoiled children of the Carsons didn't understand what they were truly doing. They thought they were above the world they mocked, that their money shielded them from any real consequences. But Danielle knew better. She had spent her life dealing with people who looked down their noses at her, thinking their status alone gave them power over the lives of others. Yet, as much as she wanted to lash out, Danielle simply stood still, watching them, taking in their laughter, their mockery. She wasn't about to let them see how much their words hurt. The humiliation continued in waves. As Danielle moved toward the bar, hoping to find something to wash away the dryness in her throat, the bartender looked up. His eyes darted to Margaret, who had just entered the scene. Margaret, with her sharp, aristocratic air, caught the bartender's gaze and shook her head sharply. "No drinks for the help," she called out, her voice dripping with venom. "She doesn't deserve even water from our glasses." Danielle, who hadn't eaten in hours, whose feet ached from standing outside in the cold, felt the sting of that rejection more deeply than any verbal insult. But still, she said nothing. Her composure was too important. This was a game they were playing, and she would not let them see how much it affected her. Brandon, ever the clown, strolled over to her with his champagne flute raised. "If you want to feel useful tonight," he slurred, "why don't you go help the real staff serve real people? At least then you'd be doing something you're actually qualified for." Sophia, who had been watching, clapped her hands together in delight. Yes, finally, something she might actually be good at. The guests roared with laughter, finding joy in the mockery, in the display of power they thought they held over her. Their cruelty was their entertainment. Danielle turned away from them, forcing her legs to move, though every step felt heavier than the last. She found a quiet corner and attempted to sit, hoping for just a moment of respite. Her feet ached in the stilettos that now seemed designed to punish her, and she longed to gather herself before the night's events unfolded. But as she reached for a seat, Margaret blocked her path. "Those chairs are for guests," Margaret sneered, her gaze assessing Danielle with clear disgust. "Not for whatever you are." So Danielle stood. She stood, silent and unmoving, as the Carsons' guests paraded past her, laughing and whispering, pointing and staring, treating her as if she were an object of ridicule. She became their spectacle, their evening's entertainment, all because she had the audacity to exist in a room they thought they owned. She could have left. She could have walked away and taken the deal with her. But something inside her held her ground. She would not be their punching bag, their joke. She was here to show them something they had never understood, what it meant to truly own your dignity. And soon enough, they would learn. The grand ballroom was buzzing with a mix of conversations, laughter, and clinking glasses. The string quartet played on, its soft melodies weaving through the air. But to Danielle Carter, the music might as well have been a distant hum. Her ears were full of the cruel whispers, the mocking laughter, and the biting comments that swirled around her like a storm she couldn't escape. She felt the eyes on her, the judgment, the sneers of the very people she had once hoped to do business with. They had already reduced her to the role of the fool, unworthy, inferior, disposable. And yet, as each second passed, her resolve only strengthened. This was why she had come. This wasn't just about sealing a deal, signing papers, or shaking hands with these rich, entitled people. No, this was something deeper, something far more personal. She wasn't here to be humiliated. She wasn't here to let them win. She had worked far too hard to let this moment define her. As she stood, observing the crowd, she noticed more than just the guests laughing and recording her. There were others too. People who were beginning to look at her differently, no longer entertained by the spectacle, but growing aware that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Sophia Carson, with her perfect hair and fake smile, had just walked by her again, laughing with a group of socialites, when something caught her eye. Sophia's gaze lingered on Danielle's figure, her eyes narrowing as she approached. "Oh my God, I feel so bad for you," Sophia said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You look so thirsty here. Let me get you something to drink." Danielle looked up, surprised for a moment by the politeness in Sophia's voice. It felt like an oasis in a desert, something so rare, it was almost too good to be true. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a hint of decency left in the Carson family after all. But as the words left Sophia's lips, Danielle saw the cruel twist that no one else in the room was paying attention to. Sophia was holding a glass of red wine, her smile widening with malicious glee. Danielle reached for the glass without hesitation, thinking that after the hours of standing in that cold vestibule and the mockery that had followed, the wine might bring some relief, if only temporary. But as Danielle's hand reached toward the glass, something unexpected happened. Sophia deliberately stuck out her leg. It was subtle, the kind of move that anyone else might miss. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but to Danielle, it was deliberate. Her foot caught Sophia's outstretched leg, sending her stumbling forward. There was a moment of pure horror as Danielle lost her balance, her elegant gown billowing out like a flag of defeat. Her hand shot out instinctively to catch herself, but it was too late. The wineglass in Sophia's hand followed through with the same cruel precision, crashing down onto Danielle's pristine white gown, staining it in a burst of crimson that spread like a wound on a battlefield. Danielle hit the marble floor with a sickening thud, her knees and palms stinging from the impact. The laughter erupted around her in waves, louder this time, more cruel. The clinking of glasses mixed with the sound of phones being pulled from pockets, cameras zooming in for that perfect shot. Sophia gasped, playing the part of the innocent victim to perfection, her eyes wide with fake horror. "Oh my God, you're so clumsy," she cried out, her voice high-pitched and almost gleeful. "I'm so sorry. I was just trying to help." Danielle, humiliated and covered in wine, remained on the floor for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The entire room watched, captivated by the scene that had unfolded. Some guests were grinning, others were recording, and a few stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Danielle knew exactly what was happening. This was not an accident. This was no clumsy spill. This was a calculated act, a final blow in a game that had never been about business. It had always been about power. As she slowly began to rise, wiping the wine from her gown, her mind was racing, but her body remained still, her posture straightening, her face composed. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. They had made their mistake, and now it was time to make theirs. But something in the room had shifted. As she rose, her phone vibrated in her hand, a familiar sound that caught the attention of everyone nearby. Without a second thought, she pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an incoming call from James, her legal counsel, confirming that the merger documents were ready to be signed. Danielle's calm voice cut through the chaos of the room. She answered the call, but there was no panic, no anger in her tone. Only a quiet, unsettling composure that seemed to freeze the atmosphere around her. "Richardson Global, Danielle speaking," she said, loud enough for those closest to hear. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Miss Carter, this is James. The Whitmore contracts are ready for your signature. Should I bring them over tonight for the announcement?" For a split second, Danielle could feel the shift in the room, the weight of what she had just said hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. The guests around her, so wrapped up in their cruel entertainment, stopped mid-laugh, their faces suddenly filled with uncertainty. Their eyes darted to one another, questions unspoken but echoing in the room. Whitmore contracts? Merger? But they were still too absorbed in their phones, in their recordings, in their own self-centered enjoyment of her humiliation to truly process what had just happened. Brandon was still laughing hysterically, playing back his video of her fall, while Sophia stood in the corner, posing for photos, as if nothing had changed. Danielle's voice remained calm, almost chilling. "Cancel everything, James. Every single contract." The phone call was met with silence from her audience. The clink of glasses stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. James, sounding puzzled, replied, "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Could you repeat that? Cancel what exactly?" "The entire $1.3 billion merger. The real estate deals, the technology partnerships, all of it." Danielle's voice dropped low, but it carried clearly across the room. She knew everyone was listening now, their curiosity growing like an unspoken hunger. For a brief moment, the room stood still. Edward Carson, still in disbelief, could feel the blood draining from his face as the magnitude of what was happening sank in. He pushed his way through the crowd, moving toward Danielle with increasing urgency. But by the time he reached her, it was already too late. The damage had been done. As he approached, panic in his eyes, he blurted, "Excuse me, what did you say your name was again?" His voice cracked with desperation. Danielle turned toward him, her face impassive, her voice perfectly calm. "Danielle Carter, CEO and founder of Richardson Global Industries." She reached into her purse, pulling out a platinum business card, the kind that only a few people in the world could afford, let alone carry. She handed it to Edward with a quiet dignity, as though greeting a head of state, not a man who had just publicly insulted her. His hand shook as he took the card, and as he read it, his expression faltered completely. He looked up at her, his face drained of color, his mouth working in vain to find words. The room, still frozen, began to hum with recognition. Danielle's eyes scanned the crowd, watching as their faces went from amused indifference to stunned realization. She wasn't just the woman they had humiliated. She was the woman who could ruin them all. Yes, she continued, her voice carrying effortlessly through the silence. The merger that was going to save your bankrupt company. The merger that was going to inject $1.3 billion into your struggling empire. With those words, everything changed. The laughter stopped. The phones were lowered. Danielle gave them a cold, almost pitying look as the weight of the situation sank in. They had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. The room was suddenly suffocatingly quiet. The laughter, the derisive comments, the cruel jeers, all of it evaporated like mist in the early morning. Danielle Carter had spoken, and the gravity of her words hung in the air like an unspoken threat. $1.3 billion. Merger. The words rang out, sharp as glass shards, cutting through the air and shattering the delicate illusion of control the Carson family had so carefully constructed. For a moment, the room remained suspended in time. The string quartet's music, which had been so soothing just minutes ago, now sounded like a distant echo, irrelevant against the new reality that was crashing down around them. The guests, those same people who had found amusement in Danielle's humiliation, were now standing frozen, their faces draining of color as the enormity of what was happening sank in. The smartphones that had been recording her every move now lay forgotten in the guests' hands. Their screens dimmed as the weight of the situation took hold. Danielle stood in the center of the room, as poised and unmoving as a statue. Her gown, now stained with the remnants of Sophia's wine, seemed almost symbolic. Imperfect, yet still powerful. She had been thrown to the floor, humiliated, mocked, and yet she had risen, not just physically, but mentally. She wasn't the one who was defeated here. She wasn't the one who would bear the consequences of this night. They were. The once lively buzz of the party had transformed into an uneasy silence. Danielle didn't need to look around to know that the Carson family was reeling. She could feel it in the tension, the way people were suddenly avoiding her gaze, the way Edward Carson, still clutching the business card she had handed him moments earlier, seemed unable to process the reality unfolding before him. Danielle's eyes met his across the room. He was visibly shaken, his usual veneer of arrogance shattered. His hands trembled slightly as he glanced at the card again, then back at her. But no words came out. Behind him, Patricia Carson, her face pale, eyes wide, moved forward in a way that could only be described as a desperate shuffle. She was a woman used to commanding rooms, to being the queen of social gatherings. But in this moment, she looked nothing like that. She looked small, vulnerable, like a woman whose world had just been yanked out from under her feet. We didn't know, Patricia said, her voice cracking slightly. She stood in front of Danielle, her words stumbling out, like a woman caught in a tide she could no longer swim against. I didn't know who you were. If we had known. Danielle held up a hand, cutting her off. It doesn't matter who I am, Patricia, she said, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. What matters is how you treated me. How you treated me, and how you've treated others like me your entire lives. This isn't about power. It's about basic respect. Patricia flinched, as if the words had slapped her across the face. She opened her mouth to protest again, but no words came. She looked from Danielle to her husband, and for the first time, there was no certainty in her eyes. There was only fear. Fear that was spreading like wildfire across the room. As the silence stretched, the weight of the truth began to settle in. The guests, who had been so eager to record Danielle's fall, now stood frozen, their minds racing, each one processing the same horrifying realization. They were complicit. They had laughed. They had mocked. They had recorded the humiliation of a woman whose signature was the very thing that would keep their precious Carson empire from crashing to the ground. It was in that silence, thick and heavy with the realization of their mistake, that something inside the Carson family finally broke. Brandon Carson, still clinging to his glass of champagne, staggered forward. His face was flushed from the alcohol, his steps unsteady, but his mouth worked quickly, like a man trying to talk his way out of an abyss that was already swallowing him whole. "Look, we didn't know who you were," he said, his voice slurring. "I mean, come on, this is ridiculous, right? You can't just walk in here and ruin everything over one stupid mistake. You really want to destroy everything over a little misunderstanding?" Danielle's gaze flickered to him. Her eyes were cold, stone cold. The hurt, the anger, everything she had held in check up to this point suddenly felt distant, irrelevant. In that moment, she wasn't the woman they had humiliated. She wasn't the woman who had walked in with dignity and grace, only to have it torn away by their cruelty. No, she was something far more powerful. Brandon stumbled closer, continuing his rambling. "I mean, this whole thing is crazy. You're not going to do this, right? You can't be that heartless. You know, we're family, right?" "Family?" Danielle echoed, her voice soft but deadly. She took a step toward him, her eyes narrowing as she fixed her gaze on his face. "Family," she repeated again, letting the word hang in the air like a bitter joke. "Family doesn't humiliate each other for sport, Brandon. Family doesn't laugh at each other's pain, record it, and post it online like it's entertainment. You can't claim to be family when you've stripped away every ounce of humanity to make yourself feel superior." The words landed with a thud, each one heavier than the last. Brandon's face shifted from confidence to confusion, and then to something that resembled dread. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. It was Sophia Carson, however, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation the quickest. She had been standing off to the side, her eyes darting nervously between her parents and the growing tension in the room. Finally, her gaze landed on Danielle, and for the first time that night, there was no mocking smile on her face. There was no cruel jest in her posture. Instead, she looked at Danielle with a mixture of fear and disbelief, her hand clutching the edge of the bar, as if she might fall. I didn't mean for it to go this far," Sophia stammered, her voice weak, her usual venom now completely absent. "I was just having fun, you know? Just a joke. It's not a big deal, right?" Danielle took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving Sophia's face. "You thought humiliating me was funny, Sophia. You thought making me the joke would make you look better. Well, now you know what happens when people like you think they can treat others like nothing." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat. She had no defense. Not anymore. The silence in the room deepened, suffocating. Every guest who had once been so eager to share in the mockery now felt the weight of their complicity. They had witnessed cruelty, they had witnessed an injustice, and they had participated in it. But it wasn't too late to change. They could still make it right. But the moment passed. The damage was done. And in that silence, Danielle made the final decision. She wasn't here to fight for approval anymore. She wasn't here to save anyone but herself. And with a chilling calmness, she lifted her phone once more, dialing a number that would seal the fate of the Carson family. The penthouse that had once been a symbol of wealth and status now felt like a house of glass, fragile and transparent, shattering piece by piece. The guests who had been so eager to mock, to record, to revel in the humiliation of Danielle Carter now stood in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing the unraveling of a dynasty, one they had helped unravel with their own hands. The tension was thick, like the weight before a storm, each breath drawn in the room feeling heavier than the last. Danielle stood at the center, unmoving, her presence cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. She had been pushed to the floor, mocked, humiliated, her dignity trampled on by people who thought their money, their power, their position would shield them from any consequences. But Danielle wasn't like them. She wasn't driven by ego or pride. She was driven by something deeper, something they had underestimated, the strength of her will and the knowledge of her worth. The Carson family, Edward, Patricia, Sophia, Brandon, each of them now stood with the weight of their actions pressing down on them. Their faces had gone ashen, their once confident, smug expressions replaced by varying degrees of panic. The laughter had stopped, and the once vibrant energy of the gala had dissipated into an oppressive silence. Their empire, built on the backs of privilege, now teetered on the edge of destruction. And it was all because of one woman they had thought to demean, one woman they had thought was beneath them. Danielle's phone buzzed in her hand, a reminder of the power she held. She glanced down at the screen, her eyes briefly flicking across the name. It was her legal team. Her counsel, James, had been on standby, waiting for her to give the word. For a moment, she let the room hang in that heavy silence. The guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, watched her, their eyes wide with confusion, apprehension, and, yes, fear. They were finally starting to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a petty squabble. This wasn't a woman lashing out in anger. This was something far larger, far more powerful. This was business. This was the end of their world as they knew it. Danielle slowly lifted the phone to her ear, her gaze never leaving the Carson family. She was a picture of calm, poised, the very definition of control, in a room filled with people who were losing theirs. The sound of her voice, steady, unwavering, was the only thing that broke the silence. "James," she said, her tone cool, almost detached, as though this moment was as much a business transaction as any other. "Cancel everything, every single contract." The words hung in the air, each one dropping like a bomb, in a room too stunned to react. The gasps that followed were barely audible over the soft hum of the lights overhead, but they were enough to make the room feel like it was closing in on everyone. The guests, who had once been so eager to record her downfall, now exchanged glances, unsure whether to apologize or flee. They had been complicit in this moment, accessories to a crime they had failed to understand. And now, they were witnessing the beginning of their own unraveling. Danielle's eyes locked onto Edward Carson, who had been fumbling with the business card she had handed him earlier, as if it might somehow change before his eyes. His face was drained of color, the once proud patriarch of the Carson empire now standing before her like a man who had just seen his entire world collapse. "Edward," she said, her voice colder now, almost icy. "This deal, this merger that you thought would save you, it's over." The words were simple, but their weight was immense. It was as if a curtain had been drawn back, exposing the illusion of the Carson family's wealth and power for what it truly was: fragile, built on lies, greed, and entitlement. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around the room, as if searching for something, anything to save him. But there was no escape. The truth had been revealed, and it was too late to undo the damage. "You can't," he managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't do this. Do you know what this will mean for us? For our legacy?" Danielle tilted her head, considering him with an almost pitying gaze. "Your legacy," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Your legacy is built on the suffering of others. Your legacy is built on the idea that you can treat people like disposable objects, like nothing. But now you'll learn what happens when you cross someone who knows their worth." The silence was deafening now. Even Patricia Carson, who had spent her life wielding power over others, stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had built her entire identity around being part of Manhattan's elite social circles, using her connections to control who was in and who was out. But now she was nothing. They were nothing. And Danielle? She was everything. "I didn't know," Sophia Carson said suddenly, her voice breaking through the silence. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean for this to happen." Sophia's voice was shaky, her mask of cruelty slipping away, but there was no remorse behind her words. Only fear. Danielle's gaze turned to her, her eyes as cold as the marble beneath her feet. "You didn't mean for this to happen? You didn't mean for me to be the punchline to your jokes? For me to be the target of your cruelty? I don't believe that for a second, Sophia. You knew exactly what you were doing." Sophia flinched, the words striking her harder than any physical blow. She opened her mouth, trying to speak, but no words came. Behind her, Brandon Carson, still holding his champagne glass, his eyes wide with panic, stumbled forward, his voice slurred from the alcohol. This isn't fair. You can't just take everything away like that. We're family. We didn't know, okay? If we had known. Danielle's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, her patience thinning. Family, she repeated. You don't get to call yourselves family when you treat people like dirt. You don't get to pretend you care about family when you've spent your life stepping on others to get ahead. You knew exactly who I was, Brandon. You just didn't think I mattered. The room had gone completely still. Every eye in the penthouse was on them now. The realization hit hard, as it always did. Danielle Carter wasn't just some woman who had walked into their world. She was the one who held their futures in her hands. And as she stood there, in the middle of the Carson family's ruined empire, the truth settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. There was no going back. The empire they had so carefully built was now reduced to rubble. Danielle's next words were quiet, but carried the force of a hurricane. You thought you could ruin me. You thought you could humiliate me. But what you didn't realize is that you've just destroyed yourselves. She pulled out her phone again, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she made a call. The room watched, stunned, as she spoke to her legal team once more. James, she said, her voice steady. I want the entire $1.3 billion redirected to our Minority Business Partnership Fund. Every penny. I want it used to fund Black-owned businesses, Latino entrepreneurs, Asian American startups, and Native American enterprises. The room was dead silent as the words echoed through the space. The Carsons had just lost everything they had fought so hard to maintain, and the world would know exactly why. The silence in the room had become unbearable, thick and suffocating, as if the very air was trying to hold its breath. Danielle stood at the center, an island of calm in the midst of a storm that had only just begun. The Carson family, once proud and untouchable, was unraveling before her eyes, and every word, every glance, every second that passed seemed to add more weight to the looming collapse. Edward Carson, still holding her business card, looked as if he had aged 10 years in the span of a few moments. His face was drawn and pale, his usual confidence drained, leaving behind a man who had just realized he was no longer in control. His hands trembled as he looked from the card to Danielle, and back again. His mouth opened and closed, as if searching for words that no longer mattered. I don't understand, he muttered, his voice shaking. This isn't how it was supposed to go. This was our lifeline, Danielle, our last chance. Danielle's gaze remained unwavering as she met his eyes. There was no pity in her expression, only the cold clarity of someone who had already made peace with the truth. She didn't need to explain herself. The reality of the situation was already unfolding before their eyes, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. You had your lifeline, she said quietly, but you chose to throw it away. You could have treated me with respect, but instead, you chose cruelty. And now you'll pay the price for that. Patricia, who had been silent for the longest time, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. You can't just take it all away. This is our legacy. My family's legacy. This is the end of everything we've worked for. Danielle's eyes flicked toward her, but her voice remained even. Your legacy, Patricia. Your legacy is built on a lie, on power and privilege, on stepping on people like me to stay at the top. I'm not the one destroying it. You are. The words hit like a thunderclap, and Patricia staggered back, as if physically struck. Her hand went to her chest, clutching at the necklace that had once been a symbol of her social dominance, now feeling like a heavy weight that had lost all meaning. She tried to say something, but the words were lost on her. The Carson family, standing together just moments ago, as if they were invincible, were now splintering apart before the guests, and they knew it. Around the room, the guests stood in stunned silence, unable to look away. They had been complicit, whether they wanted to admit it or not. They had laughed, they had recorded, they had participated in the degradation of a woman who had the power to destroy them all. And now, they were witnessing the moment when their own complicity would come back to haunt them. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, and no one knew who to turn to, who to blame, or how to escape the fallout. Brandon, still clutching his champagne glass, looked like a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath him was crumbling. His face twisted in disbelief as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The laughter, the mockery, all of it had seemed like a game, a joke. But now, he was staring into the abyss, and he had no idea how to pull himself back from it. "This is crazy. This is insane," he slurred, stumbling forward, his speech growing more frantic. "You can't just take everything. You can't just cancel it all. It's not fair. We didn't know. We didn't." Danielle's gaze cut through him like a blade. "You knew enough, Brandon. You knew enough to laugh, to mock, to treat me like I was less than you." Her voice dropped lower, the words coming out slowly, deliberately. "You just didn't think there would be consequences. But now, you're learning that there are." His face drained of color as her words settled in. He looked around the room, desperate for someone, anyone, to step in and fix this. But no one moved. No one spoke. They all understood that the damage had been done, and now they were watching the Carson empire crumble in real time. Sophia, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, finally found her voice. "This isn't happening," she said, almost to herself. "This can't be happening." Her voice cracked. And for the first time that evening, her carefully constructed mask of indifference faltered. The realization hit her hard. All the years of manipulation, of playing people off each other, of using her beauty and charm to get what she wanted, were suddenly meaningless. She wasn't the queen bee anymore. She wasn't the one in control. "No, it's happening," Danielle said quietly, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "And there's no going back now. You made your choices. You humiliated me. And now you're going to lose everything because of it. Saw it." The room went silent again, the weight of her words hanging over them all. It was clear now that this wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. It was a reckoning. The Carson family had crossed a line, and there was no way to uncross it. They had thought they were untouchable. They had thought that their money, their influence, would shield them from any real consequence. But now, they were about to lose everything. Danielle looked at each of them in turn, her eyes scanning their faces. Edward, Patricia, Brandon, Sophia. She could see the fear creeping into their expressions, and though she had no sympathy left for them, she couldn't deny that there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their cruelty. "Do you know what the real cost of all this is?" Danielle continued, her voice cold but clear. "It's not just the $1.3 billion merger. It's the people who are going to be affected by your actions, the businesses you've destroyed, the lives you've ruined. You thought you could use me to save your empire, but you never bothered to understand the price of what you were asking. And now, you're paying for it." The Carson family stood there, paralyzed, as the truth settled around them like a thick fog. The guests, the bystanders, all felt it too. The weight of their complicity. The weight of the mistake they had all made in thinking that they could get away with treating Danielle like she was less than them, like she was an object to be tossed aside, humiliated for their amusement. But now, their mistake had been exposed, and they were about to lose everything. In that moment, the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around them. The Carsons were no longer the powerful family they had once been. They were just people, standing in the rubble of their own hubris, realizing that they had brought it all down on themselves. Danielle turned away from them, her back straight, her composure unshaken. "I'm done here," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a final judgment. "I don't need your approval. I don't need your apologies. I've made my decision, and it's already too late to change it." And with that, she turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the Carson family and their entire world behind. The Carson family's once glorious empire, built on decades of wealth, power, and social prestige, was now crumbling, its foundations shattered by the very people who had thought themselves untouchable. The penthouse, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a tomb. The echoes of Danielle Carter's words reverberated in the air, still fresh and searing in the minds of everyone who had been a witness to their downfall. In the days that followed, the Carson name was splashed across every major news outlet, social media platform, and business journal. The headlines were harsh and unforgiving. Billionaire CEO cancels $1.3 billion deal in the wake of racial humiliation. Carson Empire collapses after mocking black businesswoman. The price of cruelty, how the Carson family destroyed themselves. The media circus that had once surrounded the family now turned against them. A tidal wave of negative coverage that drowned every shred of their carefully constructed image. Danielle had made her decision, and the ripple effect was swift and brutal. The contracts with the Carson family's once loyal partners were terminated immediately, with legal teams working overtime to sever any remaining ties between Richardson Global and the Carsons. The $1.3 billion merger, the deal that was supposed to save their failing empire, was gone in an instant, and with it, the Carsons' hope for survival. The story wasn't just about a botched business deal. It was about how a moment of cruelty, a single act of disrespect, had shattered a dynasty that had stood for generations. Edward Carson, the once proud patriarch, had tried to salvage what little remained. In the early days after the fallout, he made frantic calls to anyone who would listen. He reached out to influential friends, old business partners, and even government officials, hoping for a miracle, for some way to undo the damage that had been done. But no one returned his calls. No one was willing to stand by him when the world was watching. When the Carson family had been exposed for what they truly were, the reality of their situation began to set in. Patricia, who had spent her entire life basking in the glow of Manhattan's elite social circles, found herself shut out. The charity boards she had chaired, the country clubs she had once ruled, all began to distance themselves from her. Invitations to events that had once filled her calendar stopped coming. Her carefully curated world was falling apart, piece by piece. The reality was too harsh for her to accept. She spent days in a haze, pacing the floors of their now empty mansion, her mind racing with thoughts of how to salvage what was left. But it was clear now, their status was gone, and there was no way to buy it back. Sophia Carson, once the darling of every social scene, found herself unceremoniously dropped from sponsorships, brand deals, and the social media influencer circuit that had once seemed so promising. Brands that had paid her thousands of dollars to wear their clothes now sent cease and desist letters, distancing themselves from the scandal that had erupted around her. Her carefully curated Instagram posts, once filled with glitz and glamour, now became a source of mockery. The videos from the gala, the ones she had recorded and shared with her friends to laugh at Danielle's expense, were now circulating on every platform, with captions like, "Racist Trust Fund, Baby Loses Everything." Sophia's followers, once adoring, now turned on her. The comments section on every post was filled with backlash, with people reminding her of the cruelty she had shown. She was no longer the starlet she thought herself to be. She was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in a world that had become increasingly aware of its own flaws. And worst of all, there was no one left in her circle who could help her. Brandon Carson, the family's golden boy, who had never worked a day in his life, was the first to feel the brunt of the consequences. His behavior that night, recording Danielle's fall and laughing along with the others, was now an infamous moment in viral history. The video spread across every platform with millions of views, each one punctuated with hashtags like number #RACISM, COSTSBILLIONS, and number TRUS, TFUND, BABYEX, POSED. Companies that had once shown interest in hiring him for various business ventures now publicly distanced themselves, citing his inappropriate behavior and lack of maturity. The family's wealth, once enough to shield him from real consequences, was no longer a buffer. His trust fund was frozen, seized to pay off mounting debts from the collapse of the Carson family's holdings. Brandon, who had never known a life outside of privilege, was now forced to find work on his own. He found himself in a cramped apartment in Newark, living a life that felt like a cruel joke. At 29 years old, he was waiting tables at a fast casual restaurant, trying to scrape by with the kind of wages he had never had to think about before. The days of expensive cocktails and late-night parties were over, and the cold reality of his situation hit him harder than anything he had ever faced. His friends, the ones he had partied with, the ones who had once admired him for his wealth, now avoided him. The Carson family's financial troubles quickly became public knowledge. As their empire continued to crumble, the banks they owed money to called in their loans, one by one. Credit lines were frozen, and properties that had once been worth millions were now being sold off at a fraction of their value. The Carson family estate, the very building that had hosted the gala where everything had come undone, was put up for auction. The final blow came when the Carsons' prized Manhattan penthouse, the one that had once symbolized their status, was sold for $80 million, a steep drop from its previous value. The buyer? A consortium of minority-owned real estate firms, many of whom Danielle had personally recommended to the auction house. The irony was not lost on anyone. The penthouse, once the crown jewel of their empire, was now a symbol of their fall. And the money from the sale didn't go to the Carson family. It went to fund scholarships for underprivileged students, many of whom came from the very communities the Carson family had once dismissed. As the months passed, the fall of the Carson family became a case study in every major business school across the country. Professors used the story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance, privilege, and systemic racism. The Carsons had learned the hardest lesson of all, that cruelty and discrimination, no matter how subtle or overt, can cost a person everything they've built. In the end, the Carson family's downfall wasn't just about the billions they had lost. It was about the way they had treated others, about how they had used their power and wealth to humiliate and degrade people who they believed were beneath them. They had used cruelty to climb, and now cruelty was pulling them down. But for Danielle Carter, the story was different. The woman they had humiliated, the woman they had tried to destroy, had walked away not only with her dignity intact, but with the respect of a nation. She redirected the $1.3 billion to a fund that would support minority businesses, entrepreneurs, and communities that had long been overlooked. She became a beacon of strength, of justice, and of resilience. Danielle didn't need the Carson family's approval. She didn't need their wealth. She had everything she needed within herself: the power to change the world, and the courage to stand up for what was right. And in the end, that was the legacy that mattered most. What do you think about the Carson family's downfall? Do you believe their actions were the result of their arrogance, or was there something more at play here? Danielle Carter's powerful response was truly a turning point. But the real question is, how do we ensure that such behavior is never tolerated again? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more incredible stories like this one. By subscribing, you'll gain access to even more valuable insights on power, resilience, and justice in today's world. Join the conversation, and let's keep the dialogue going.